As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. I think after not being able to record or taking a hiatus, I think I'm getting back into the swing of things, and people are going to be hearing the amazing guests that I have and bringing back political education in an accessible way. Today, joining me is someone I deeply respect. I've had the fortunate experience of listening to at various conferences, and I find their work to be truly lucid and clear in a time amongst so much confusion. So, welcome for the first time. I think this is long overdue, but welcome for the first time to the Malcolm Effect, Professor Navid Farnia. How are you, Professor?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm excited to be here.
It's an absolute honor and privilege to be in conversation with you, and I truly appreciate the times I've been able to listen to you, and they actually stuck with me. And I think when I last saw you at the International Studies Association conference, it was in my mind brewing for quite some time that I wanted to discuss the question of Syria, not so much what's happening right now, but how we got here, but in particular vis-a-vis imperialism. So I guess to kind of lay out the scene for our listeners and context, can you help us situate Syria in regards to imperialism? And my listeners should know we don't do any of this sub-imperialism stuff. When we say imperialism, we mean U.S. imperialism, right? So how do we understand Syria in relation to U.S. imperialism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that Syria's sort of relationship to imperialism is really it dates back to even before the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the French colonized Syria. But, I won't go into that kind of background. What I will talk about is specifically the United States involvement in Syria, particularly in the 21st century, right? So a lot of folks like to date the U.S.'s involvement in Syria back to 2013, 2014, maybe sometimes back to 2011 when the so-called protests began in Syria. But in reality, the United States was plotting and planning, for sort of operations to destabilize Syria even before that, right? So the United States imposed sanctions on Syria, the Assad government, back in 2003. And, since then, back in 2006, U.S. officials were talking about fomenting sectarianism in Syria, just like they had in Iraq, right? So these kinds of things, the U.S. government was already doing even before the war kicked off in the 2010s, right? And all of this should be sort of seen as feeding into the destabilization of Syria and the subsequent U.S. occupation of Syria in 2016, 2017, 2018. In the 2010s, with the sort of kicking off of the war, the United States became increasingly involved, particularly in funding and financing and even arming militant groups, including documents have revealed that the U.S. was secretly funding and arming organizations even like ISIS, right? ISIS, al-Nusra, which, is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda and eventually became the HTS. So those kinds of relationships existed. Even the New York Times and these companies were talking about these relationships as if the weapons were being somehow mistakenly even falling into the hands of these right-wing militant groups, these extremist forces, right? But in reality, the relationships run deeper than that, and I think it's important to point out that those relationships are what enabled these groups to further destabilize the Syrian government, gain a foothold, and eventually, for the HTS's perspective, take power, right? Beyond that, I'll also say that the United States in 2015, 2016 established a relationship with what became the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds in the eastern part of the country, which is what enabled the U.S. to establish a military base in the eastern part of Syria and essentially occupy the country, take over its oil resources, take over its wheat resources, and therefore basically economically devastate the country even more so than it had through sanctions, right? So all of these factors really led to the destabilization of Syria, the sort of the breaking down of the Syrian state over time, and enabled what happened last year, the coup that ousted Assad, right? So all of this history should be taken into account, and I think it's important for everybody to understand this.
So I guess immediately the question I have, clearly the US has had a long-standing plan to destabilize Syria. And we also know in terms of de-development and accumulation in the region, the US has a long-standing plan for reshaping West Asia or the Iran Arab region. So I guess the first question will be, why is the US so involved in the case of Syria particularly? And I think something that we are constantly in conversation with people who are from Syria, etc., is this thing of, okay, we know that there's outside forces involved versus the real grievances people had against the Assad government as well. So I guess there's a long-standing two kind of questions there. One is why is US imperialism so invested, or the opposite, de-invested, I guess, in Syria, and also, how do we balance or how do we begin to have this conversation, which I know is going to lead into our other conversation about the axis of resistance, etc., but particularly the role of grievances, legitimate grievances against Assad government, but also a kind of overarching structuring logic of US imperialism?
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually those two questions are related. I think those, I think they can, I'm glad you brought them up together because I think they can and should be addressed together. But to your first question, I think there's several reasons why there's several reasons why the U.S. and the West are interested, particularly in Syria. One is Syria's historical relationship with resistance in the region, particularly the Palestinian resistance. Right, that relationship has ebbed and flowed over the decades, particularly since the 1970s. But by and large, the Syrian state has been supportive of the Palestinian resistance. And in that respect, that is a direct direct challenge to Zionist hegemony in the region and therefore U.S. imperialism in the region as well, right? And so, like I said, that ebbs and flows over the decades, but it doesn't fundamentally, it doesn't, like the sort of confluence of forces in Palestine and in Syria consistently challenge U.S. imperialism, and so that confluence must have been, was a major source of reason behind why the U.S. wanted to destabilize the Syrian state. The other is Syria's historical relationship with Russia, which dates back to the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union was one of the most prominent supporters of the Syrian state during its existence, and in fact, during the era of the Soviet Union, Syria existed under what was called Arab socialism, right? So Syria was essentially a socialist state with sort of Arab characteristics, but that affected capital flow, right? That affected the flow of oil and Syria's resources and access to those resources. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Syria sort of shifted away from a socialist model and tried to sort of embrace a market-driven model based on the economic and political climate around the globe at the time, right? The 1990s were obviously a period of retrenchment for socialism and communism. Even socialist states like Cuba were deeply economically devastated by what happened with the Soviet Union. And so Syria tried to manage by shifting toward a market-driven economy, toward financialization in many respects. And that improved relations with the West to an extent, but not to the point where anything would sort of fundamentally alter what the West designs were for Syria, right? But the important thing to point out with respect to that is that as Syria shifted more toward a market-driven economy, it sort of de-emphasized support for the peasant population in the country and really began engaging with the bourgeoisie and the Syrian bourgeoisie, right? And so in that respect, whatever support that, like significant support that the Syrian state would have from the peasant population was sort of drained away over time, and we see that manifest in what happens in the last 10, 15, 20 years, right? So in that respect, these two questions are related. And then the other thing is, Syria's relationship with Iran and other countries in the region that oppose U.S. hegemony, right? We already talked about Palestine, obviously, but Syria's relationship with Iran was a major source of friction with the West. And in fact, the West offered to lift the sanctions on Syria as long as it repudiated its relationship with Iran, but Assad refused to do so. So the relationship with Syria, Iran, Russia, Iran, and Palestine are all go into why the West wanted to ultimately achieve what it called regime change in Syria. And I should lastly, let me also quickly add that with Russia, obviously that relationship extended beyond the Soviet Union into the 2010s, where we see the Russians coming into Syria to help stabilize and preserve the Syrian state in the face of attacks by these Western-backed right-wing extremists, right? So, I'll finish there.
No, thank you so much. And I think I'm recalling the work of Ali Qadri, in which he talks about the political economy of Syria post the fall of the Soviet Union and the re-entrenchment of a bourgeoisie or what we know as capital flight leaving Syria, right? Which obviously then produces the material conditions that people often will have legitimate grievances about, right? But I think fundamentally what this analysis misses is that, not this analysis, sorry, but analysis that says, okay, this was, the Arab version of Hitler, and we had to go no matter what. It's a very liberal take that refuses to take a historical approach to how these forces and conditions are produced, which I find quite frustrating in a lot of discourse today. I mean, I remember, because of the circles that I'm in, and, identifying as a Sunni, Syria was a topic that you couldn't really say much about, right? It was a topic that you couldn't say much about. Otherwise, you're called an Assadist, or you're called a genocide denier in some cases, etc., and all this kind of insults. But I think now I would hope that people will be open to hearing what is a sober analysis, that is not a take that just valorizes a particular individual, but realize that these are structural questions that we're trying to locate and identify and discuss. But something you said that stuck out to me when we last met, when you said that Assad was the weakest link within the Axis. And is that still your position? And if so, or if not, why did you say it then? And how do we begin to understand Assad's relationship or Syria's relationship to the axis of resistance? But I think you said about Syria, so let's make it about Assad particularly.
Yeah, absolutely. In short, yes, that's still my position.
Okay, thank you.
The reason why I believe that to this moment is because twofold, right? One, everything that we've already discussed, the degradation of the Syrian state over time, its inability to sort of play a major role in the resistance axis in the region in an active sense, beyond the sort of supply lines and the things that we might talk about with respect to the axis of resistance here in this podcast later. But so that's one. But the other aspect, the other reason why I say that is because when there were reports after October 7th that the Axis wanted Assad and Syria to open up a front in the Golan, right? The Hezbollah was opening up a front in northern occupied Palestine, attacking from there. Yemen was obviously, taking care of the Red Sea, ultimately imposed a successful blockade of this Red Sea, and obviously what was going on in Gaza, right? So the resistance wanted Syria to open up a front in the Golan, but Assad didn't do so, in large part because I believe, and I think others do so as well, that he was enchanted by the prospect of normalizing relations with the Gulf countries, and what this might have done, this attack in the Golan, would have hindered that process, right? And so, to me, those are the reasons why I saw Assad as the weakest link in the axis, because the rest of the resistance was actively participating, right? Iran didn't become active until later, but it was clear that Iran was operating behind the scenes, and then the other forces were actively participating. Even the popular mobilization forces in Iraq were actively participating in the resistance. And so what does it mean for like the only state actor other than Iran that's in this axis was not actively participating when Hezbollah, when Ansar Allah, when the PMFs, and obviously the PIJ and Hamas were operating, right? And so that reflects to me a position of weakness. And in that respect, I wasn't completely surprised when the Assad government fell last December. Obviously, it was a major strategic setback for the axis of resistance. Obviously, the situation in Syria today, right now, is tragic, catastrophic, and we can talk about these things. But it wasn't particularly shocking given the developments that were taking place already.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about the Syrian state more largely ebbs and flow, and then Assad being enchanted by his relationship or a possible welcoming back to the Gulf countries, right? But then, what will people will often then say, who are like, many of my Syrian friends will say, this demonstrates whatever people say about Assad and the Axis and him supporting Palestine, these kind of things prove their point that he was never really in it for Palestine. So how do we remove that kind of, one-sided approach to an analysis doesn't really take into consideration a totality? How would you then respond to that?
Yeah, that's a good, important question. For one, we point to the history of Syria's support for Palestine, right? Even if that history is loaded in Syria's own interests, that to me is irrelevant. Every state operates based on its own interests, including Iran, including Russia, right? We see that. So but nonetheless, Syria was supporting the Palestinian resistance for decades, doing so against the Zionist regime because they saw a common enemy in the Zionist entity. Two, we point to what's happened since December of last year. The fact that the new Syrian government, the HTS government, has closed the Palestinian resistance offices in Syria, has deported these resistance leaders, including from the PFLP and the PFLP General Command as well, right? So the fact that the supply lines, the Syrian state is policing the movement of supplies, Iran and Iraq to Lebanon, right? All these things, the fact that the Syrian state now is talking about normalization with the Zionist regime, all of these factors point to the reality that the Syrian state now is far less friendly to the Palestinian resistance than the previous Syrian government. Whatever one may think of Assad, the Syrian state was staunch in its support for Palestine, and I think that cannot be historically denied. One does not negate the other, right? The fact that Syria did not act after October 7th, after Al-Aqsa flood, doesn't change the fact that Syria was part of the axis of resistance and was a major supporter of the Palestinian liberation struggle for decades, including even after October 7th, if not in the way that the Axis would have desired, it still did so, right? So that doesn't negate the fact that he was also a weak link, right?
Yeah. two things can be in contradiction, but both be true, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And absolutely. And I think some of the conversations I've been having that are quite frustrating is that, and we can talk about this we can talk about this a bit later when we think of Syria today. Actually, let me come back to that question. I think a very pointed question I have is quite straight up: why did Iran let Assad fall?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm actually not convinced that they did. I think that they tried to preserve his government until the last minute, until the last week, I should say, in a more literal sense. I think the summer of 24, summer of last year, there were reports that the Iranian government warned Assad that this sort of offensive is coming from the north, and that their preparations are being made for this offensive. And for whatever reason, the government did not take at least enough necessary precautions to prevent that. But there are also reports that after the offensive began in late November of last year, that came from the north, from Idlib province. There were reports, particularly from a Chinese investigation, that hasn't gotten a lot of public consumption, at least in the West, that when that began, when the HTS forces began attacking Aleppo, some of Assad's senior generals in the Syrian Arab Army in Aleppo, who were with an Iranian military advisor at the time, arrested the military advisor and basically laid down their arms and allowed the HTS to take Aleppo, right? So the question about why HTS was able to accomplish a coup, I think, is less related to Assad himself and more related to what was happening in terms of the army, the morale of the army, particularly at the senior level, and why, and perhaps there was, a lot of Syrians I've seen have talked about a betrayal. I think that's the betrayal that they're referring to. I don't think they're necessarily referring to Assad himself. I think they're referring to senior elements in the army that refused to fight when the HTS waged its offensive in November and December, right? So Iran, seeing all this happening, I believe, tried to cut a deal in the end to say that we want to maintain some semblance of presence within the country, even after Assad. I don't think it worked out for them particularly. But I think Russia was also involved in that deal. And I think Russia, I said from day one that the Russians wanted to maintain their military bases, and they have been able to do so, even if they don't have much of a presence beyond that. So all of that to say that I don't think that Iran or Russia wanted Assad to fall or were okay with it or even allowed it. But I think internal elements within the army itself led to ultimately what happened, which was the coup, right? So,
yeah, I really appreciate that response, actually, because I think some of the conversations I've been having normally veer towards this. We've seen what is probably not even half of Iran's capabilities during the 12-day war, right? And we saw what Putin's intervention was able to do. It materially propped up Assad for all this time, right? So I think many onlookers are asking the question: if this capability is available, the fact that the coup took place, it would seem to suggest that it was allowed to happen.
Yes, it was allowed, I think, internally to happen, right? But beyond that, taking aside Iran and Russia's capabilities, right? What about Syria's capabilities, right? We've seen like all of the destruction that the Zionists have done against Syria's capabilities since the coup. That, all that destruction shows that Syria has had great capabilities to withstand whatever assaults that were waged, offensives that were waged from the north, right? At the very least, stand tall for a duration of time, which it didn't. Like, there was no attempt made to do so. And I think that wasn't like, I think that everyday soldiers, like from the Syrian Arab Army, were willing to fight. But it seems that it was a question of senior leadership that for some reason laid down their weapons. Maybe a deal was cut. And I think we've seen actually some of that leadership has been integrated into the new Syrian state since the coup, right? That supports the fact that it was them that allowed this to happen, right? And, beyond that, Russia, it's interesting to ask whether Russia would have allowed this to happen if Ukraine wasn't going on, because I think that Russia has been very much entrenched in Ukraine, and that has hindered its ability to play a greater role in other parts of the world, in West Asia, than perhaps it would have before what was happening in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, right? So that's an interesting question to consider. But at the end of the day, I'm not even sure that it was that it would have made a difference in that respect either, because if the Syrian army itself at the senior level wasn't willing to fight, then I'm not sure that Iran or Russia or any other foreign actor could have done anything to prevent what happened, right? The people themselves and the state itself has to be able to support itself, and then whatever support comes from the outside is obviously important. And in 2016, 2017, that support actually helped the Syrian state withstand whatever assaults that were taking place at that time. But the difference this time was the Syrian state, for whatever reason, did not at the army level senior leadership.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think listening to hear you speak generates so many questions for me. So I know we only have an hour, so I'm trying to temper the questions that I think are the most important and what I'm commonly hearing. But something, how would you respond to the question that, and I don't want to do this in a way of like I'm being contrarian or proxy. I'm just asking the question because this is what I hear, and I'm very sincerely interested to hear what you have to think about this. But I think I'll say my view first. It sounds like a lot of cope when people say this line, what I'm about to say. But so, the fact that Israel is bombing Syria today, bombing near Damascus and near the presidential palace, and bombing whilst Jolani is in power, proves that Jolani is a greater threat to Israel than Assad ever was.
Yeah, I think that's, again, I mean, obviously that's, not only ahistorical but counter-historical. All one has to do is follow the news, right? Just a couple weeks ago, the Syrian officials met with Zionist officials in Baku, right, to discuss normalization, to discuss a security arrangement at the very least with each other in order to disrupt, undermine the acts of resistance, particularly in Lebanon, right? But I would also emphasize Iraq as well. These realities, also the facts that I pointed to earlier, the fact that this new Syrian government closed Palestinian resistance offices in Syria, deported its leaders, right? The fact that...
Can I just interject? Because I mean, I hope you know these are not my views, and our listeners know these are not my views. But I say this because it is such a hot topic in the circles that I'm in that I think I really do appreciate having this conversation, just frankly and openly. So when people say, I mentioned this point about the offices and the supply lines, people say, but the new Syrian state just wants to be quote unquote, and this is what I quote this verbatim, left alone, right? It shouldn't be a place in which it's used as a launch pad to attack other people. It should be, after so many years of degradation, it should be a place in which Syrians should now feel safe. Again, seeing the images of the Druze communities and other minorities is a slap in the face to that point that Syrians want to be left alone, because the question becomes, when you say Syrians and you invoke the term Syrian as an abstract concept, as an abstract, what do you mean? All too often, this seems to be the Sunni majority.
I mean, if you want to be left alone, the first thing to do is to rid your country of occupation. So it's not, I mean, like, Iran was never occupying Syria. The United States occupies Syria, over a third of the country in the east, right? Stealing its oil resources. Since the coup, the Zionist regime, the Zionist entity, has occupied basically now the entire south, to the extent where I saw reports the other day that the Zionist regime, the military, is 10, 12 kilometers outside of Damascus. I mean, that, like, if the notion of being left alone is what you want, then you have to be able to defend yourself. And if the Syrian state now is not defending itself against occupation, then what exactly does it stand for? What exactly does it want? And these are the questions that we need to ask. So anytime somebody asks that, the Syrian people, they want to be rid of foreign forces, then why are you only looking at one way, at that question from one perspective, ridding the Syrian state of Palestinians, of Hezbollah, of the Russians, of Iranian military advisors, but you're not asking the question of ridding the country of the U.S. military occupation, ridding the country of now the Zionist occupation, of now the Turks, who are playing a major role in the country, which is actually perhaps receding in the moment because they're not doing anything to counteract the Zionist actions, right? The offensive of the Zionists. So what's being done to counter these things, right? What's being done to counter the Zionists? I mean, since the coup, in the days, like in the week after the coup, just like 4 or 5 days, maybe 7 days, the Zionist regime destroyed 80% of Syria's defense capabilities. Those defense capabilities don't belong to one person in one government. That belongs to the Syrian state that was built over decades. And so if the people cannot defend themselves because the state can't defend itself, then what are we talking about being left alone? If anything, this creates the possibility for more intervention, for balkanization, for fragmentation. So that's
exactly. And we've seen the lessons from Libya, right? We've seen the lessons of different. We have too many. History will history repeats itself and people seem to ask the same questions. And I don't know, it's tough because I think what happens is oftentimes there is a lot of emotion involved, and the greatest evil becomes culminated in one individual, as opposed to the questions that take a more structural analysis. And I think this is the conversation. And again, and I'll be honest, I've been a part of those things where even I have not wanted to speak about Syria, but I think what is going on right now demands that people talk and say, and no longer be afraid to be labeled whatever label you're going to be called, because these are structural realities. And I think we have to ask these questions and attempt to have some kind of response to them at least. So I do appreciate these. Sorry.
Yeah, and can I also add that the anti-imperialist camp saw this coming, right? Like all along. They knew, those in the anti-imperialist camp in the West knew that if Assad was going to fall, it would look something like this, right? Balkanization, basically, like you said, what happened in Libya, right? So it's not as if like this was sort of unseen, like an unfounded, an unseen development. Not at all, right? People talked about this. People talked about this development. And I think that needs to be pointed out because a major factor that led to the demise, the destabilization, the weakening of the Syrian state before the coup were the psychological warfare that was involved in sort of creating confusion around the Syrian government and thereby the Syrian state under Assad, right? That confusion allowed the sort of international sort of large-scale consensus that was created that this guy is evil and therefore he needs to be, that whatever happens with his demise will be a quote-unquote revolution, when in fact people in the anti-imperialist camp knew that it was going to be a counter-revolution, and that's exactly what it's been, right?
So that's very interesting. You mentioned the anti-imperialist camp, right? The camp of which yourself and I both belong. I think what will be interesting then, I guess a question of what would you say the anti-imperialist position is when it comes to particularly sovereignty and state? Because I think people often have a struggle to say, okay, if people are suffering in a place, is the position that you defend the state no matter what?
I think the position has to be that whatever internal contradictions exist within a country, whether in Syria, whether in Iran, or Mozambique or Sudan, whatever contradictions exist in countries in the global south / third world, those contradictions cannot be resolved if the contradiction of imperialism and foreign occupation and foreign meddling and influence are not resolved, right? Whatever change of government that takes place in a country like Iran or Syria that have historically been anti-imperialist countries, anti-U.S. countries historically, whatever change takes place in those countries is not going to be a progressive change, but in fact is only going to lead to the further degradation of self-determination and sovereignty, and therefore the political and economic realities in those countries. And so that's why I always emphasize to people that the internal contradictions cannot be separated from the external, right? Imperialism can't be set aside over here from what's happening internally in terms of the Syrian economy, the Syrian military, so on and so forth, right? These two factors have to always be seen together. And once they're disaggregated, that's when the imperialists can come in and say, oh, you know what, oppression is taking place under Assad, and something needs to happen, right? People are being oppressed, so we support regime change, we support whatever, right? We can't disaggregate the two. As those of us who are staunchly in support of national liberation can always have to be clear that the internal contradictions in a given country are fundamentally related to imperialism. Once that disaggregation is made, that's when we are put on the defensive and we have to engage in conversations. We have to dance around the main issue, right? And get into the nitty-gritty of personal politics and whatnot, right? And that's what we want to.
And speaking of anti-imperialist listeners, I posted this already, but you can I highly recommend checking out the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective for these types of analysis, right, in which centers anti-imperialism and imperialism as a primary contradiction. Okay, so large question again, so please feel free to take it in direction. First being, what are your thoughts on what's taking place in Syria now? And what do you think of Jolani?
So my thoughts are, first of all, let me start by saying what's taking place is catastrophic. It's extremely tragic for the Syrian people. I primarily say that for the Syrian people because We've seen thousands of people massacred, not just in the last couple of weeks, right? People have emphasized what's going on in southern Syria with the Druze population and the Bedouins, that sort of conflict. But also, let's not forget what was happening on the coast, on the Syrian coast back in March, when the HTS forces were massacring Alawites in particular on the coast, right? So it should be emphasized from jump that this is extremely catastrophic. The second thing I'll say is that undoubtedly the coup and the implementation of this government, the coming to power of this government, the HTS government and Jolani himself, has been a strategic setback for the regional resistance. That can't be denied. And I'm not going to try to deny that because I myself believe that as well, that it's a strategic setback. But one of the things that I've constantly pointed to in my own conversations at conferences, as you've mentioned, is that there are certain things that we also need to pay attention to, right? And my main thing is that new contradictions have emerged since the coup that are only going to escalate over time. So for one of those contradictions being that the Zionist increased presence in southern Syria is going to bring it more and more into contact with the Turks, right, with Turkey. And so all these forces that are pro-Western, pro-NATO forces are going to come into contact with each other, already doing so. And it's going to create new tensions, new contradictions that provide opportunities for the resistance to leverage and take advantage of, right? I think right now the resistance is sort of laying low in Syria. I think there is an organic Syrian resistance in the country right now. I think part of that is the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, the SSNP. Also, I think maybe connected to that is this new organization that I heard about called the Islamic Resistance in Syria, that sort of, I guess, likens itself to the Islamic resistance in Iraq and also Hezbollah in Lebanon. But right now, I think all of those resistance forces are laying low. And I think the primary point of contention that's taking place in Syria is the Zionist forces and the Jolani and his Gulf-backed, Qatari-backed, Turk-backed the HTS government, right? Turkish-backed HTS government. I think that's an opportunity for the resistance. Why? Because if we look at it from the Palestinian perspective, the conflicting forces in Syria right now are, on the one hand, the genocidal forces, Zionists and the imperialists, the U.S., and on the other hand, the so-called two-state forces, right? And both sides are weakening, have the potential to weaken each other through this conflict, and that only strengthens the resistance, right, and the liberation forces in the region. We've seen this historically where in Iraq, obviously Iraq was fragmented, was basically devastated after the U.S. invasion, but Iran used the weak state in Iraq as an opportunity to support the Iraqi resistance, which now exists today as the Popular Mobilization Forces, right? I think something similar could happen because Iran and other forces in the region are very good at harnessing and helping to sort of cultivate resistance forces, non-state actors in weak states. And I think there is an opportunity for that in Syria as well. But I think people need to be patient. I think that's going to take time, and we'll see it unfold over time, right? In the meantime, there's the question of,
is Jolani an asset
to the West?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the fact that these normalization conversations are taking place so quickly after the coup speaks to that reality, right? There were reports that Jolani a couple of years ago, he went to Europe and he was being trained by, I think, either CIA or MI6 agents on public perception and how he sort of presents himself and whatnot, right? And so I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think the more interesting question to me is, is Hezbollah going to re-enter into Syria in a sort of in a substantive way? Is the Iraqi resistance going to enter into Syria? Because the potential advantage of that is to take the war into Syria rather than have the war be in Lebanon or in Iraq. And we know that the conversations right now are about, are the Zionists going to reinvade Lebanon? Or, is HTS itself going to invade Lebanon? Because Thomas Barak talked about, quote unquote, Syrians see Lebanon as quote unquote beachfront property, right? Trying to foment this sort of threat of HTS invasion of Lebanon if the Lebanese state doesn't force Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance to lay down their arms, right? So the question is, does the Lebanese resistance say we want to take the war into Syria to destabilize, to take advantage of the destabilized situation there, rather than to confront the situation on our home ground where we might face internal issues, right? So like these are the questions that I find to be interesting.
Thank you so much. And then finally, you mentioned being patient, but I think given the gruesome images and harrowing images that are a daily occurrence now that are emerging out of Gaza, and our full solidarity remains for Palestinian liberation. We've seen obviously the great figure Hassan Nasrallah being assassinated, and we've seen so many what seems to be decapitations. We saw, well, I mean, Iran held its own in many, it absolutely did. I guess final question would be, maybe again a large question, but pulling at some threads here, what do you think the state of the Axis is right now?
I think the Axis is doing well. I think the Palestinian resistance is doing very well. I think let me start off by again saying like I think I don't want to come off as callous, and I want to point out like all the atrocities that you've pointed out, right? All of this, the starvation, the attacks on the quote unquote humanitarian lines for aid, which are in reality death traps, right? I want to point out, like, obviously want to elevate all that, right? The targeting of civilians. But I also want to say that the targeting of civilians is precisely because the resistance is doing well. The Palestinian resistance, in particular in Gaza, has escalated its operations since the 12-day war last month. And that's because the Iranians weakened the Zionist ability to monitor and surveil what's happening in Gaza, providing an opportunity for Al-Qassam and Al-Quds and other resistance forces to lay ambushes and to engage in other pre-planned operations. Right? We shouldn't see these sort of operations as separate as from what was going on with respect to Iran. So I think the resistance is doing well. Yemen has reactivated in a major way, obviously since last month. Has sunk 2 ships, conducts almost daily attacks against the Zionist regime, but more importantly, continues to enforce the blockade in the Red Sea to the point where the port at al-Rashrash or Eilat was shut down this past week, like altogether, right? Altogether. So all of this to say that these notions that the resistance was weakened after the coup in Syria or after the assassination of Nasrallah and the pager attack in Lebanon, all that, yeah, Hezbollah is regrouping for sure. Hezbollah suffered major losses for sure. The leadership in Hezbollah has acknowledged that. But if we look at the other fronts and we see what's happening on the ground, we get a clear sense that the resistance is doing well. And of course, it's going to take hits, right? But we shouldn't understand like those hits in absolute terms, right? We have to look at this all in relative terms. Relative to the Zionist regime and the imperialists, right? The Zionists have been far weakened to a far greater extent than the resistance. And I think that needs to be front and center. Hezbollah is going to reactivate. People who are worried about the Lebanese resistance need not worry. They'll be fine. They're not going to disarm. They refuse to disarm, particularly seeing what's happened in Syria and particularly seeing the threats that are daily imposed upon the Lebanese, right? They're not going to lay down their arms. In Gaza, things, the resistance, like I said, is withstanding. And I'll end by saying this, right? If we look at liberation struggles historically, they don't unfold in 1 or 2 years. The Haitian Revolution took 13 years, and the country was destroyed multiple times before the Haitians won their liberation. The Zimbabwean liberation struggle took 15 years. The Algerian liberation struggle took 8 years. The Vietnamese struggle took 30 years. And so, to expect that the Palestinian resistance is going to win in 1 or 2 years is unfortunately not realistic. It's just not. And so what the resistance is counting on, and they've said this in their statements, is a war of attrition, a protracted war. The Palestinian resistance has said this. The Iranians have said this. During the 12-day war, the Iranians said, we're prepared for a long war. Contrast that with the Zionists. Netanyahu himself said, we're not going to fight a war of attrition. So for those of us who support the liberation of the Palestinian people and the liberation of the region, we have to take cues from the resistance. If they say they're fighting a war of attrition, then we ourselves need to be entrenched in the long term for this as well. And we can't allow ourselves to engage in defeatism when setbacks happen. We can't allow ourselves to engage in adventurism that that ultimately hinder the cause, and we need to stay steadfast, right, in terms of what we're doing. We're heading in the right direction.
Absolutely. And I'll end on that note. And I think, once again, this is a place in which this is a platform which is dedicated, absolutely in no uncertain terms, to the liberation of Palestine. With that in mind, we say with all the images that are daily occurrence now, which are horrific, we also understand that we are also students of history, and we recognize that what the reading of history allows for us is that it shows us what is possible. And I think it's important to know what is possible is that you mentioned Haiti, you mentioned Algeria, Zimbabwe, and so many other liberation struggles of the continent of Africa, and they're still ongoing. Decolonization did not signal liberation, right? And there's still ongoing struggles. So it's absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you, Prof. I hope this is not the only time, and I'm sure we'll have more to talk about in the future. I highly recommend people engaging with Professor Navid Farnia's work, and I'll put some links to some of his work in the episode description. Until next time, peace out.